Your dependence on the arcane has made you weak. Your body is corrupted, and your soul is tainted. No arch-seraph could love you in your current state. Not even the gods would pity you, were they still able to look upon your wretchedness. But I love you, my child, despite your sins and your treachery. And in my love, I am here to offer you a chance at redemption, a chance to find Imperious's forgiveness, a chance to earn my forgiveness. So where are the others?
Hello, my name is Byrne, and this is what you need to know about running your villains for your D&D campaign. When I write these scripts for these videos, very often I think I'm going to start talking about one thing and quickly realize I'm talking about another. And that happened when I wrote the video about morality in dark fantasy. I thought I was doing a video on villains and pretty quickly realized I was actually writing about story hooks and the main narrative thread in your morally complex dark fantasy campaign. Well, this is the video on villains. This video is going to tell you how to construct a villain for a dark fantasy D&D campaign. So these are the 5 steps that I follow when I'm crafting my perfect villains for my dark fantasy campaign. Step 1, decide on the core concept of what you want your villain to be. And an easy example of this is whether your villain's a monster, and if so, what sort of monster are they? Step 2 is to decide on your villain's motivation. What do they want during the campaign? Step 3 is to decide how they're going to get their motivation. What steps are they going to take to overcome the party and achieve what it is they're trying to. Step 4 is to flesh out your villain's personality. Once you know what their motivations are, once you know what sort of monster they may be, you can decide on their personality traits, bonds, ideals, and flaws if you want to use that sort of scaffolding. And step 5 is to make sure you're role-playing your villain throughout the campaign. Do not let them sit and wait to be murdered by the party. Make them an active participant in the story as it's being told. The place where I start when I'm deciding what sort of villain I want to feature in my dark fantasy D&D campaigns is what I call the core concept. What sort of villain do I want to feature? And an easy example of a core concept is, what sort of monster do I want to use in my campaign? Do I want the party to have to go up against a vampire who is manipulating everything in the realm and draining it dry of blood? Do I want the party to go up against a lich who is harvesting souls, or a dragon that is hoarding treasure and magic items in a mountain that looks over the rest of the realm? Of course, your campaign doesn't have to feature a monstrous villain. You could have a villain who's just an ordinary person, but has a lot of social or political power that makes them dangerous to the party, even if they're not a physical threat. For example, Cersei Lannister is one of the greatest villains in fantasy. Or Silco from Arcane makes for a great morally ambiguous villain who has very understandable motivations. Or perhaps you want to feature someone like Lex Luthor, someone who's incredibly intelligent and can convince everyone around them that the party are the real threat, not they themselves. If you are going for a more, dare I say, mundane or human villain, maybe you want to decide what their occupation is, and that will help you to define them with a core concept. Are they perhaps the king of a realm who is oppressing the people around them? Or are they an advisor to the king who is whispering poison into the king's ear, and that is causing troubles? Or maybe they're a cult leader or a demagogue who is drawing more and more cultists to them daily to help them summon an ancient god. Of course, in a dark fantasy campaign, your villain may have more morally ambiguous motivations and therefore may not be so obviously villainous. Maybe your core concept is that the villain is actually a paladin, someone who crusades for justice and goodness, but their crusade just happens to be against arcane casters, trying to stamp out arcane magic throughout the realm. And the problem is that, well, half the party happen to be arcane spellcasters. So now the paladin is trying trying to stop the party and hunt them down because they believe that the party are the ultimate threat to the realm. And look, to be fair, most parties don't do much to dispel the notion that they are a threat to everyone around them. Whatever your core concept for your villain happens to be, the core concept will help inform what your villain's motivation is. Vampires need to drink blood, liches need to reap souls, dragons love gold and riches. So once you have the core concept of your villain, the sort of villain that you want to feature in your dark fantasy campaign, the next step is to decide what their motivation is. What is the main thing that your villain is going to try to accomplish over the course of the campaign, and how is it going to bring them into conflict with the player characters? Remember not to think of your villain as overly villainous. You want to be able to sympathize with your villain. Villains that represent all that is reprehensible and horrible in the world, such as Sauron, is great for a high fantasy or heroic fantasy campaign. But in dark fantasy, we want the moral lines to be a little bit grayer than pure black and white. So finding a villain with a sympathetic motivation, something that the player characters can relate to, something that you can relate to as the dungeon master, because you're the one who has to roleplay this villain, is a great starting point for how you're going to continue to craft the personality and the actions of this villain during the campaign. You know, a great villain from recent TV show is Silco from Arcane. He is a fantastic dark fantasy villain because he is absolutely reprehensible. He uses violence, fear, addiction, and manipulation to get what it is that he is trying to accomplish. But in his own mind, what Silco is trying to accomplish is equality for the people that he considers himself to be the leader of, even though he quite frequently victimizes the people he's claiming to try to liberate. The other thing is that Silco has that really fatherly relationship with Jinx, is also a massively humanizing, sympathetic aspect of the character that has made the internet forget about all the other reprehensible things he does during the story of Arcane. Having a villain that the party can sympathize with helps capture that moral ambiguity that is so important for a dark fantasy campaign. Maybe you have that dragon who is threatening to burn down the city out of revenge for something that happened to them before the campaign started. Or maybe you have a fey creature who is trying to protect the forest from the encroaching civilization. Unfortunately, some farmers and some wagon drivers are getting munched on by some horrible fey creatures as the fallout of people invading into the fey's realm. So now you have the core concept of your villain, what or who they are, and you have their core motivation, what it is they're trying to accomplish. So how are they going to accomplish this? What steps are they going to take to fulfill their motivation, and how does this bring them into conflict with the player characters? Is your villain someone who acts directly in accomplishing their goals? Are they a bandit who leads their party of not so merry men and goes around violently attacking villages and raiding farms personally to gather riches to themselves? Or are they someone who sits back and influences the course of events in their realm indirectly, using minions and agents to accomplish their goals? This is a good time to talk about the sorts of minions that your big bad evil villain might use, because nobody can accomplish everything on their own, and maybe they need a little bit of help on the way. Does your villain use a gaggle of kobolds that march out into the realm and come back in a conga line covered in stolen riches? Are they a military leader who has an entire army that they're able to use, maneuvering them around the realm to hunt for the party and try to trap them? Or do they use hidden agents and assassins who try to get the jump on the party, killing them before they even realize that they're targeted by the big bad villain at all? What is the preferred method that your villain uses in accomplishing their goals? Are they a vampire or a barbarian warlord who wants to tear apart their victims with their own hands and let the blood rain down on them? Or are they someone who detests violence and would rather not use it if they didn't have to? Maybe they do have assassins who go and eliminate the folks that need eliminating for them, or maybe they try to pay off their enemies And you can ask the player characters, are they willing to compromise on their morals for a little bit of gold? Or are they someone who has a high charisma and wants to try to politically influence the campaign? Try to turn the party's allies against them through propaganda and mistruth. What is the main weapon that your big bad evil villain has in accomplishing their goals? The truth is your villain probably isn't going to use just one method, and they're going to conflict with the party in multiple different ways. But your party can also learn the weaknesses of your villain by observing the methods they use to try to accomplish their goals. Maybe there's a way that the party can gather allies to themselves and convince the realm that this is an evil that they need to stand together to go and defeat. So by this point, we have a pretty good idea of who our villain is for this campaign. We know what sort of monster they are, whether literally or metaphorically, and we know what it is they want. So this is going to inform us a fair bit about our villain already. But this is the part where you flesh out your villain's personality and get their personality traits, ideals, bonds, and flaws, much like you would for a player character. Maybe you don't need that scaffolding if you love character creation, you love creating new characters for stories, but if you're somebody who does need a bit of scaffolding, a bit of help with fleshing out a character's personality, using what the players use, the personality traits, the ideals, bonds, and flaws, is a great starting point for you. Is your villain quick to anger? Are they fairly slow in their mannerisms, in their mood? Are they a joyous villain who takes delight in the violence and the misery that they inflict on people? Or are they someone who detests violence, and when they get blood on their shoe, they have a minion come and wipe it off for them? What is their bond? Are they tied to their family, or are they tied to a specific place that they treasure and are trying to protect from the player character's intrusion? Are they tied to the idea of something? Maybe their background is that their family did once rule the kingdom and they're trying to get back to the throne again, and so their bond ties them to the idea of being the regency of the realm. Their bond is tied to the throne itself. What is their ideal? What do they believe about themselves or the world around them? Are they a me first kind of villain who doesn't care about anybody else? Or do they believe that they're a fighter of freedom, trying to liberate an oppressed people? Or do they believe that they are trying to stamp out a great evil in the realm who just happens to be one of the party members? And finally, their flaws. Is there some exploitable flaw that the player characters can use to get back at the villain later in the campaign once they've interacted with the villain a little bit and learned about this flaw? Is the villain greedy, or are they quick to anger? Is that their flaw? And so they can be lured into a trap with either riches or an insult that is particularly stinging to the villain. Your villain is your player character as the dungeon master, so you should feel free to flesh out their background, flesh out more about why they are motivated to try to accomplish what it is they're trying to accomplish. The one pitfall that I would warn you against, though, is just not becoming too attached, because the function that they play within the campaign is to be the foil to the player characters, and in all likelihood, the player characters are going to kill them. They're already trying their best to do so from when the campaign begins. And you want to root for your players as they hunt down your big bad evil guy. You don't want to lament too much when they are finally defeated and killed. Don't let your villain sit in the last room of the last dungeon on their ridiculous throne of skulls with their massive sword of fire and their big skull hat crown of ridiculousness, just waiting for the party to come and kill them. Have your villain take an active role in your D&D campaign. Have them actively go out and try to accomplish their goals while trying to thwart the party. Have their influence felt throughout the campaign, and have them try to stop the party from accomplishing their goals. Roleplay your villain between sessions, even if they're not appearing on camera. I constantly walk around my house talking to myself in my villain's voice, trying to decide what I'm going to do next based on the news that the villain is receiving about the player characters. Ah, yes, I see that they have managed to capture the castle of Ermengarth. Surely I shall send agents across to the tower of and there they will wait for the player characters to arrive and
slay them where they are.
This actually causes problems around my house where my fiance sits in the other room and says, "What are you talking about?" You can even introduce a little bit of metagaming if you're playing a villain who happens to be a particular tactical or political genius, someone who is able to predict your player character's movements throughout the campaign. So maybe they learn a little bit more than they should and are able to predict where the player characters are going to go next. But that is only the case if you are playing a genius. You probably don't have more brain power yourself than the 4 to 6 other players at your table combined.
You underestimate my power!
And so it's okay to introduce that level of metagaming to create the illusion that your villain is a genius. But if you're not playing a villain who is an explicit political or strategic genius, try not to metagame. Maybe you write a list of things that your villain could practically have learned through agents and spies, or maybe a little bit of scrying, and you make another list of things that your villain could not possibly have learned about the party yet. And based on that first list, you decide what the villain is going to do next in the campaign and how they're going to try to thwart the party. Maybe they're successful in doing so, or maybe the party come up with some idea that's not on that first list, and so the villain isn't able to thwart it. Get your villain off their throne and get them into the game, because your party are much more likely to remember them if the villain is showing up and their influence is felt multiple times throughout the campaign. In fact, you should and could even introduce your villain at the very start of the campaign, in the very first session. One of the most memorable campaigns I had was when the villain rode up on the party in the dead of the night on the road between 2 villages and had quite a pleasant conversation with them. But the paladin used divine sense and learned that the villain was undead and instantly became terrified of them. And as the campaign continued to unfold and the party learned that they were in fact the villain that they were fighting against, it cemented a relationship between the party and the villain from the very start of the campaign. And the relationships between heroes and villains is what makes villains memorable. If you have a villain that is shrouded in mystery, however, someone whose influence is meant to be felt but not seen throughout the campaign, you should probably at least make it clear that the party are fighting against someone. I have had mystery villains before who are sort of manipulating things from the background, and if it's not clear who the party are fighting against, even if they don't know the singular identity, sometimes they don't really know if they're fighting against anyone. It can become really confusing. So try to have some sort of modus operandi, a badge that all the villains' agents wear, or something that they always say, a name that they keep referring to, even if the party have no idea if this name refers to a lich or a dragon or a king. Just something that the party can latch onto as being the identity of the villain. And then towards the end of the campaign, it's revealed that this individual they thought was a simple merchant king was a beholder living beneath the city who's been manipulating everything all along. It is incredibly hard to compact all my thoughts about how to create memorable villains for a dark fantasy D&D campaign into a concise 20-minute video. I hope that made sense. I hope that was clear. I hope that was helpful. But if you have any questions, if you want me to elaborate on anything, throw a comment down below. I do read through the comments and I will try to answer your questions. Alternatively, email podcast@ghostfiregaming.com and check out the Eldritch Lorecast, where I have chats with Dale Kingsmill, Sean Merwin, and James Hake, and we talk all about D&D, giving all our different opinions and invariably getting in some kind of argument about water elementals. Make sure to subscribe if you enjoyed this video, like the video, hit the bell icon like a town crier alerting everybody that the orcs are invading, and I will catch you all next week because we're going to be back with another video then as well.